Ready to open your heart to me?
Well, we'll see.
Today's guest is the English mathematician Sir Timothy Gowers. Among his numerous accolades is the Fields Medal he won in 1998. Well, it's a medal he pretty much hasn't seen since by the sounds of it, but we'll come to that later. I visited Professor Gowers at his office in Trinity College at the University of Cambridge. Where are you from, actually? Where were you born? You sound very English. So.
I am pretty English.
Yeah.
I was born in a town called Marlborough in Wiltshire and grew up in London.
Did you grow up with mathy people? Like, were your parents mathematical?
They were musicians, but my father was always interested in maths and did maths up to A level.
And were you like one of these prodigy boys? Like, was it obvious you were going to be a mathematician?
I was quite... I think it's sort of, when I was quite young, I sort of picked up music quickly. So that was quite a big thing. And then at school, I was one of the good ones, but not sort of far and away the best person at school,
right,
including in maths. But in general, I was sort of reasonably good all-rounder, and maths was always going to be in the mix somewhere.
Did you want it to be in the mix? Like, if I'd spoken to you as a boy and said, what do you want to be when you grow up? What would the answer have been?
When I was really young, I think I wanted to be a doctor because there were doctors in my family. But I think I wanted to be a doctor with a beard. I don't know exactly why that detail was... so I'm actually neither.
Professor Gowers is clean-shaven, for those who don't know what he is. Very, very clean-shaven.
I suppose I did have a PhD, so I was a sort of doctor for a while.
A doctor with a beard? Did your doctor have a beard? Like, where did that get into your head?
I don't know. I think maybe I may have been an ancestor. My mother's father was part of a long line of doctors in Marlborough, actually. So that may have had something to do with it. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, my father was a composer, and I think I had some aspirations in that direction at a certain age. But maths was not by a very long way, but certainly I think I would say it was usually my favourite subject at school, and I think that was partly because there was less learning to do. You just, once you understood something, of course I realised later that was only up to a certain point, and then after that point there's a lot of learning to do in maths.
Yeah. But it was like a path of least resistance at that
point. There's a bit of that, yes. I feel that there's a slight sort of element of laziness to my liking of mathematics.
Well, did you like music, or was that because your parents were musical?
I very much liked music, and music was a big part of my childhood. And I sang, for example, as a chorister in the King's College Choir here in Cambridge, which left its mark somehow. And I learned the violin and the piano. And
you're still musical now?
Yes, not very actively, but not completely inactively.
Do you still sing?
No, that stopped when I got to about the age of 18. My broken voice wasn't something that really should be inflicted on the world.
Okay. At what point then in your school years did the switch happen where it was like, okay, I'm going to be a mathematician, I'm going to take this further?
Well, quite late, because I certainly, basically, at each stage of my childhood and early adulthood, there would be, I'd be doing something, I'd be doing A-levels or a degree or a PhD, and there would be something just over the horizon, which would be the next stage. And at each stage, I wanted to get to the next stage. So when I was doing O-levels, as we did then, I wanted to do A-levels in mathematics. And when I did A-levels in mathematics, I wanted to do a degree. And when I was doing a degree, I wanted to do a PhD. And when I was doing a PhD, I wanted to get a research fellowship afterwards. And at each stage... I cleared the hurdle, so to speak.
But at O-levels, presumably you did English at O-levels as well.
Oh, yes, so there was a full range.
So there was a next stage for English as well. You could have done A-levels English, you could have done a degree in English.
Right.
Why was math the one that you wanted to jump the next hurdle of?
Well, at that point, it was because what I've said, I mean, I think I could have enjoyed English, but I think maybe it wasn't just the fact that in maths you didn't have to do much learning. It was also that... And maybe this is the tasks were sort of more well-defined. So at school, nowadays, I really enjoy writing, effectively essay writing in the form of blog posts and things like that. But at school, I really didn't like it because the task was somehow, if we take something like a history essay, that we were told to, we'd given a title and had to write it. But writing a history essay meant looking at one source, which would be a textbook, and sort of rewriting a small chunk of it in our own words and trying not to stick too closely to the textbook, but not deviating too ridiculously from it. And it was a silly exercise. Nobody really stopped to say what a good essay was, and one didn't have something. I mean, I find writing an essay is a whole lot easier if you have something you want to say in the first place. Whereas if you're churning out an essay as part of your schoolwork, you've been told what to say, and so it's not something that's coming from within that you're keen to explain to people. So I didn't enjoy the humanities in the way that if I went back now as an adult, perhaps I would. So that was another reason for the tasks that one had to do in maths were much more clearly defined, but also I think another aspect of it was the genuine intellectual excitement of things like learning calculus. I remember when I first did that, and a whole lot of problems that would have seemed completely impossible suddenly became possible. And when I saw a car accelerate, somehow my whole perception of that would be completely different once I knew about derivatives and integrals. And I really remember feeling that the world had become a clearer place after I learnt calculus, and that was very exciting.
A lot of people I've spoken to who are mathematical have spoken about how when they first got to university, that's when they got excited about mathematics because they started learning about the creative side of it and proofs and all these new things they could do. It sounds like that came a bit earlier for you, though. Like just knowing the power of the tools was what excited you, not even the creative side of it yet.
Yes, that's sort of true. But also I did have various extremely enlightened and interesting teachers. And in particular, when I was a teenager, I had a teacher, it's called Norman Routledge, who didn't just teach us the tools and, so to speak, the boring stuff, even if some of the boring stuff is very interesting, but also gave us problems that had twists and required creativity and things. And also towards the end of my school days, the Maths Olympiad became quite an important thing, and those were definitely problems where you needed a bit of creativity.
How did you do in the Maths Olympiad? I forgot that you'd done those.
I made the British team in 1981.
Right.
Went to Washington, D.C.
How'd you do?
I got a gold medal.
Gold medal.
It was an interesting one, actually. I actually got full marks, but that sounds better than it was because they were introducing a whole lot of new countries, and I think they made the questions a bit easier.
Right.
And so rather a lot of people, I think about 25 people got full marks, so it wasn't...
Right.
It's not what it would have been in another year.
There's also this, I don't know much about the Maths Olympiad, but the little bit I do know is they then have these extra medals they give for students that come up with like unexpected proofs and solutions.
Yeah, I didn't get one of those.
Never mind. You've made up for it since. Yeah. Have you still got the gold medal? Do they give you an actual medal? Like,
I actually can't remember. I remember they gave us a programmable calculator, which was quite a nice thing to get.
Yeah.
Which I had for a while until it eventually died.
Right. Did you keep it anyway, like as a memento on a shelf, or did you toss it in the bin?
It's not something I would have thrown away. I have a sort of thing that's intermediate between keeping and not keeping, which is putting it in a storage place in the house that's full of
right.
So I think it must be there somewhere, but I have no idea where exactly.
That's my one day I'm going to go with you and find that. That's on my list now. So Math Olympiad. So you were clearly very good at mathematics.
At some point, my father said to me that one thing that you can do, he'd been interested because he saw that I was interested in maths. He'd talked to one or two people he'd met and said, what kind of careers are there in maths? And
he wasn't shepherding you towards music? Because, I mean, you say your father was like not just a composer, was he? He was like quite a successful one.
Yes, he was quite well known in certain circles, so to speak.
But he wasn't pushing you to music. He was fine.
Not at all. No, I think he took the attitude that many musicians would take, which was that if someone has a real calling and they can't not be a musician, then but they better be a musician. But in a way, I was by doing maths, I was following a path that he would, in another life, perhaps have liked to follow himself. So I think I was, in a way, doing something that he was... I'm not saying I felt pressure in that direction either, but I think I was... It pleased him that I went in that direction.
As in mathematics, or as in just like academia and dons?
No, not so much academia. In fact, he himself could have been an academic musician because he did very well as academically when he was at university. And it was fairly clear that he could have taken that path, but he decided to take the riskier path of leaving and trying to make it as a composer.
Yeah. So anyway, he planted the seed, you could go into academia, you could be a professor.
Actually, it was almost the opposite. So he was saying that from the people he'd talked to, he got the impression that it was very good to do mathematics because it's always much easier to turn away from mathematics at some point than it is to go back into mathematics. And so however much of an applied type thing you want to do, the sort of, if you stay pure for a long time, then at some point you can move out from that. So it was keeping one's options open.
Right.
But he just mentioned at that point that one option, if you carry on with maths, so to speak, forever, is going into academia, but that's an extremely hard thing and you have to be, so to speak, right at the top. And so I assumed at that stage when I was at school that I had no chance of that, or that was very unlikely. But when the Olympiad thing happened, that was a sort of semi-objective measure, and I sort of realised that at least it was something that might be a possibility. But I would say even at that point, I didn't really have much conception of what it was to be a mathematician as a job.
Right.
What research was like. If somebody had said to me at that stage, what is research in maths? There's a question that people often ask, how can you do research in maths? Surely it's all been worked out 100 years ago. And once one is a mathematician, one realizes that that's just so far from being the right way of looking at things, and that every time you solve a problem, you accidentally create 5 more problems, and the subject is just completely inexhaustible.
Where did you go to university then?
At Cambridge.
Right.
But even as a beginning undergraduate, I didn't really have much of an idea of what mathematical research could be like. In fact, possibly not even starting a PhD. Because starting a PhD, one has this one feels a bit daunted that how could I, who've only just graduated, possibly solve a problem that these brilliant mathematicians over the last few decades have not managed to solve.
Why did you do it then? Why did you start a PhD?
Because I could sort of see empirically that people did go into PhDs and did solve problems and get their PhDs.
You think if they can do it, I can do it?
Well, I have a chance of being able to do it. It's just that I couldn't really see how it might be possible. And I suppose the two things that I didn't appreciate as much as at the time were, one, just how much the subject expands. And so all the time it expands. And so there are always problems that they may be quite hard, but just because they're open problems, it doesn't mean that all sorts of top mathematicians have worked on them. Sometimes people haven't got round to those problems, or they're questions that arise naturally out of a paper, but it doesn't, maybe 1 or 2 people have thought about it. But and then the second thing I suppose I appreciate now, particularly when I get to my stage, is my career stage, is just how much the experienced mathematicians, how many demands there are on their time, which maybe stop them doing a certain kind of thought. There's a certain sort of thought that you can do as a young mathematician with lots of time, which is just really worrying away at something for ages and ages and being completely focused on that thing. And sometimes that's what's needed to solve a problem. You just need somebody who will worry away at it until eventually the difficulties get chipped away and they finally end up with a solution. And sometimes the time investment that's needed and the single-mindedness that's needed for that is something that you just don't really have the opportunity for later in a career. So there's a sort of a young person's problem, and I think older people are more likely, it's not, obviously this is oversimplifying a lot and there are exceptions to everything, but older people will tend to look a bit more for something that's a bit of a quicker gain given the experience that they've built up over their career.
Right.
So that ends up often solving things that younger people might have found difficult, but it's a different style of question, which leaves open the other style of question that the younger person can...
I mean, Professor, you're clearly quite a humble person, but it would be pretty hard to deny you've become quite accomplished as a mathematician and won all these awards and have all these honours. So obviously you're like a top mathematician. At what point in your career as a younger mathematician, like at university, did people start saying to you, Tim, I think you could be really good at this. I think you could, I think you could be one of the really good ones. At what point were you getting that kind of stuff said to you? As an undergraduate, or does that happen when you become a PhD?
Definitely, no, not as an undergraduate. I think I didn't, as an undergraduate, stand out as somebody who was obviously destined for an academic career. When I finished my PhD, I got a research fellowship at Trinity College, Cambridge. That is probably, as for most people, that will be
pretty big deal.
More or less a guarantee of a career in academia, unless you just don't do anything during your fellowship.
Yeah.
So at that point, I sort of got it made in a certain way, in the sense that my career prospects were looking good.
Can you give us some idea about your area of research that you were doing at this point?
Well, I started out in an area known as the geometry of Banach spaces. So a Banach space it's a bit like a generalization of three-dimensional space to infinite dimensions. They don't have to be infinite dimensional, but large, finite, or infinite dimensional. But there's also a twist, which is that in 3 dimensions, if you want to work out the distance between 2 points, the most common way of doing it is to just add up the squares of the differences of their coordinates and take the square root. So it's using Pythagoras' theorem. But that's only one form of distance. Maybe there's a distance that people often like to talk about in 2 dimensions, actually, called the Manhattan metric. So if you're going from one part of Manhattan to another, the distance as the crow flies would be the one you'd calculate using Pythagoras. But the distance that actually matters is the one where you have always to go horizontally or vertically, because that's just because of the grid plan of Manhattan. And in general, there turn out to be many different sensible ways of putting a distance onto a high-dimensional space. If you then look at the set of points that are of distance 1 from the origin, it turns out that you get a convex body, a shape that is convex. So that means any 2 points, if you look at the line segment, any 2 points in the body, the line segment must lie entirely within the body. So there are no sort of dimples on the side. Right. That would allow a segment to pass out and then back in again.
Like a sphere in 3-dimensional space.
So a sphere is a good example of a convex body, and so is a cube. But something like a torus would not be convex, or a sort of dart shape in 2 dimensions. Is not convex. So because of this correspondence between notions of distance on space and convex bodies, that's where the word geometry comes in. So there's a study of these Banach spaces, these notions of distance on high-dimensional space, has a geometrical aspect. It's called the geometry of Banach spaces. So I worked in that. It's also a branch of a wider part of mathematics called functional analysis. So I was an analyst, but of a somewhat combinatorial kind, and then over the years I moved more into that combinatorial side became accentuated, and the analysis became lessened. I've sort of gone from a combinatorially flavoured analyst to an analysis-flavoured combinatorialist. I think that would be the way I would describe my research interests. So combinatorics I've always liked because maybe you'd say it's the branch of maths that's closest to maths Olympiads. You have sort of problems that can be where the questions can be understood very quickly and easily, but finding the solution is hard and requires a lot of ingenuity.
When you started your degree, you obviously had the whole buffet of mathematics before you. What pushed you in that direction? Was it a person? Was it just an enjoyment, a natural affinity for the subject? Why did you end up in these Banach spaces?
Well, funnily enough, it's a continuation of the instinct that drove me into maths in the first place. Well, it's 2 things. So you asked briefly whether it was an inspiring person, and the answer was yes. There was a person called Bela Bolabash who became my research supervisor and had been my director of studies as an undergraduate, who's a very charismatic and brilliant mathematician. And I had a good friend, Imre Lieder, who was his student and really clearly enjoyed it. And that was what Bolabash was doing at that point. He's a combinatorialist, but he was also working in Banach spaces at that time. So that's one reason, a particularly influential person. But another reason was that there are some branches of mathematics where you have to learn a whole lot of machinery and really get very up on the literature before you can realistically do serious research. A good example of that would be algebraic number theory, the branch of maths that goes into the proof of Fermat's last theorem, for example. Combinatorics is slightly the other extreme. You can just dive in and start trying to solve the problem straight away.
Right.
There are bits of machinery and useful tools, definitely, like in any branch of maths, but you don't have to master them all in advance. You can just pick them up as you need them. So I found that quite appealing, the same sort of laziness thing. I just wanted to get on, and I had enough after what we call Part 3 mathematics, where that was the amount of learning I had to do there was just huge, and I just wanted to stop all that and just think about problems and try and solve problems. And just at that point, I really wanted to solve just any unsolved problem. The idea of being the first person to solve a problem was just so thrilling. You had a hunger for that, like a hunger for that kind of side of it. There's I suppose, if you ask me why, it's an interesting one. Part of it was a genuine interest in the subject, but there was also this idea of sort of wanting to be the person who solved such and such a problem.
So is that almost like a fame or an ego?
No, I think I have to admit, I think there is that side to it.
There is a degree of wanting to be the person who did it, the person who found it, like the Neil Armstrong or the...
Yes, I think that wanting to get a certain amount of fame and admiration, or as somebody once put it, the grudging admiration of a handful of peers or something.
Right.
Anyway, is a very important motivation for many mathematicians, whether they admit it or not. I don't.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting aspect of the subject. It has its problematic side. So I've often felt that the most efficient way of doing mathematics might well to be far more cooperative and to share one's ideas as soon as one has them and so on. But then you have to balance that against taking away one of the powerful drivers. I mean, you've got to have something that's going to make people prepared to put in the effort to solve a hard maths problem, which will then be understood by virtually nobody in the world. So I think, unfortunately, this sort of ego-boosting side of things is an essential part of the discipline.
It's part of the compensation package.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah. So that kind of model of the Andrew Wiles hiding in the attic and not telling anyone what he's doing for 15 years or something has its merits, because otherwise that work just wouldn't get done in the first place.
Yes, it does. I mean, I feel that, though. I feel uneasy about that story being... It's fantastic that it happened, but it's some romantic stories in mathematics. There's a danger that they can be a little bit harmful, because that really is very, very untypical. And I would never, any research student of mine, I would say, don't, whatever you do, go into an attic for 7 years without telling anyone what you're working on. It's just, it was a massive risk that paid off for Andrew Wiles. He must have, I suppose, sensed that he had a reasonable chance of success. But I think for every one of those you can find... a
wasted life.
There are examples, I won't mention any names, but there are examples of people who just decided they wanted to do something a bit like that, and it didn't end well.
Do you remember your first flag-planting Neil Armstrong moment, the first time you felt like you'd found something new and significant, your first big moment like that?
It came gradually. So the first time I did anything new... I don't remember the precise moment, but the thing that I did was just a little tweak to an existing argument that improved the answer at the end, improved the bound, but not to the best bound you could possibly get. And I remember presenting that at a seminar where one of the experts in the area was present, who didn't seem, sort of, okay.
You didn't get the response you were hoping for.
Yeah, but in a way that spurred me on a little bit. And so I worried away I did what I was talking about, worried away at that particular problem, and eventually did get, by a much more complicated argument, an almost best possible answer for that particular problem.
Did that person then get impressed?
I don't know. I think he certainly would have been likely to be more interested, but... I don't know. But there was another mathematician who was very supportive to me at that stage of my career who definitely liked this result. So that was helpful. But there's another thing that I regard, the thing that I really think of as important first was not so much the first serious piece of work that I did as the first time I solved a problem that was something that I'd kind of seen at some point and dreamt about, so to speak. I mean, as it were, as a young child seeing Fermat's Larsen theorem and thinking it would be amazing to solve that. It was a bit like that, except it was local to this area. There were a couple of problems that were big problems in the area that were mentioned as open problems in one of the basic textbooks in the area.
Right.
Lovely problems. And I suddenly at some point realized that I had an idea that gave me a serious chance of solving that, and I worked on it absolutely flat out over one summer.
What was it called?
It was called the Unconditional Basic Sequence Problem. So I solved that with a complicated counterexample.
So this wasn't a proof. This was almost just like this is different to a proof.
It was a solution to a problem. The problem said, is such and such always the case? Does every Banach space have such and such a property?
Yeah. And
the answer was no. Here's a horrible Banach space that does not have that property.
So you have kind of proven something by counterexample.
Yes, you have. Yes.
Yeah.
No,
right.
It's just not maybe... Sometimes counterexamples slightly sort of close off an area, and it a little bit of that, although there were some positive outcomes as well. But anyway, the story was complicated because not long after I did it, I heard that another mathematician had also done it, actually very slightly after me, but definitely independently of me. And I was so shocked when I first heard that I realised I just couldn't do anything. So I went to the cinema. It was in the middle of I went to the cinema instead and watched Terminator 2.
It's a good movie.
Yeah, it sort of took my mind off it for a couple of hours, and I came out again, boom, it was back in my mind again.
Why did that worry you, though? You knew you'd done it, and you'd done it marginally first. So why was this such a blow to you?
Well, in retrospect, it shouldn't have been, but just at the time, it felt like losing half the half the credit for this thing, and not being the person, but it was all sort of. Actually, what happened was we then wrote up a paper together, and then there was a follow-up paper that had some other results, and I now realise that when this happens, which happens quite often when somebody solves a problem and somebody else solves it independently, you don't actually, people sort of say, wow, you solved the problem. Even if it's not independent, even if two people solve it jointly, I feel that they get individually about as much credit as if they had solved it individually. But at the time I was just sort of too inexperienced. But the shock and disappointment passed reasonably quickly.
After Terminator 2, basically. Puts everything in perspective when you see the world being annihilated.
That definitely helped, but it wasn't immediately after. But then I sort of went on and did other things as well, and so that is also a bit like if a relationship breakup, there's nothing like another relationship to help.
Yeah.
So it was a bit like that with research as well. So I've subsequently, I think every mathematical career has disappointments in it of this kind, not necessarily precisely that kind, but maybe a problem that you've been working on for a long time gets solved by someone else, and there are various different ways. But you sort of get used to that as being part of mathematical life, and just the solution to it is just to pick yourself up and keep going and do something else instead. And
yeah. So you won the Fields Medal, and I know the Fields Medal was awarded for like a body of work almost, like a consistent. Is there kind of one thing? Was there a pin-up thing? Like what would the thing be that they chip into your tombstone or something? What was your big one?
I think in my case, it was not just one big one. It is for some people. For me, it's more like a big 3 or 4 things. So there was the counterexample I've just talked about in Banach spaces, and then there was also a theorem in Banach spaces that solved positively a question that Banach had himself asked, which was, I suppose, one of my headline results. And then there was also...
Did you get your name on it? Is it called the Gowers Theorem or anything? Or
not really. That's not referred to in that way. But there is something related to it called the Gowers dichotomy, which was part of the proof.
Okay, that'll do.
Sometimes known as that anyway.
Okay.
No, in a way, that's quite a nice one.
You've got your own dichotomy. Not many people have got that. Everyone's got a theorem. You've got a dichotomy.
Yeah, if someone gets a trichotomy, then I'll be envious. But and then, but around about the time that I got it, the Fields Medal, I was... had started my move towards more combinatorial things, and in particular a branch that's now known as additive combinatorics. And so perhaps the result, if looking back now, the thing which I'd be remembered for most out of those results would be for a new proof of a result called Semiradius Theorem. It may sound a bit strange that finding a new proof of an existing theorem should be the thing that stands out, but it did do something that hadn't been done before. It gave a sensible quantitative bound for this particular theorem, which hadn't been done before. But also that the methods that went into it have been quite influential and led to other developments. So that sometimes happens, that a proof can be more important than the result that it proves, and I think that's a little bit the case here, that the ideas that went into the proof are more... The theorem is not something that you'd necessarily... Occasionally it can be directly applied to another problem, but that's less usual than the ingredients that went into the proof being applied to another problem.
Do you remember how you found out that you'd won the Fields Medal?
Yes, I do. I was summoned by my then head of department, John Coates, and so was someone else in my department. So he said, "Can you come and see me?" And so we both went in.
What did you think it was? Did you think you were in trouble? You'd been raiding the stationery cupboard.
I wasn't quite sure, although John Coates had encouraged me to apply for a chair in the department way before I would have thought it was reasonable to apply for a chair. So it was already an exciting time, and I'd got it. I knew by that stage that I'd got the chair, which came as a big surprise. A named chair it was, and I thought I was much too young in my career for that, even to sort of,
Yeah.
not to sort of insult the department to apply.
So you knew you weren't in trouble because you were in the good books at the moment.
Yes. And then he said, well, I've got some good news that you've both got Fields Medal. So this was completely out of it was very unusual. I'm not sure whether it's happened before that two people from the same department have got them at the same time. So because there were two of us, it sort of didn't feel as... I'm trying to remember. I don't think I suspected that that's what he was about to say.
Oh, okay.
And I don't think I knew that he would have any idea about it anyway.
Yeah, like the only people I've spoken to about it found out directly from that they'd won the Fields Medal, but you found out kind of like secondhand.
It wasn't totally second. I mean, he was on the committee.
Oh, okay.
Right. As I subsequently learnt.
So it was sort of part of his job to tell you as well.
Yeah.
How did you feel? You're sharing credit again. Are you having to share it with someone else?
No, that was okay.
That was okay.
That was, actually, in some ways, I think that was quite good because then, the one thing, we had to keep a lid on it until the International Congress, which was several months later. I can't remember, it was probably January or February that I was told, and then August when finally it became public.
Right.
But I think partly because it was two of us, then the sort of level of celebration and fuss that was made once it did become public within Cambridge and within Trinity, he was also at Trinity, was perhaps greater than it would have been if it had just been one person.
Yeah, yeah. Who was that, by the way? Who was
Richard Borchards,
right.
Who's at Berkeley.
Where is your Fields Medal? You don't know, do you?
Well, I kind of... I know to within of 90% certainty. So at the time, I was a bit worried about keeping something that's quite chunky and made of solid gold, just sort of keeping it in a drawer somewhere in case the house got burgled or whatever. So I decided to get a safe deposit box at my local bank, and I've put it in there, and I haven't seen it since. I haven't sort of checked. And the bank has moved branch.
Right.
So I did get a bit worried about it a few years ago, but I wrote to them and asked, I haven't really heard anything about this safe deposit box. I thought that I got charged a certain amount per year. I've not really seen anything connected with it on my bank statement for a long time. I'm a bit anxious. And they said, oh, well, no, if it was in the safe deposit box there, it would have been moved to this branch, so really there's nothing to worry about.
But you haven't gone and had a look to see
But
it?
I haven't actually got round to,
When did you last see it with your eyes?
I suppose it must be about getting on for 20 years ago.
Oh, for goodness sake. That's the other. When we go and find your calculator, we're also going to go and get the medal.
Yeah, maybe we should.
That's your next Numberphile video, digging up the relics. We'll go on an Indiana Jones adventure.
That would be exciting. Yes.
Yeah. So among you've obviously won all sorts of things, but another honour you've got that I'm a little bit fascinated with is a knighthood, because you are Sir. Are you Sir Timothy or Sir Tim?
Sir Timothy, I suppose.
Sir Timothy. So who did the sword for you? Who knighted you?
Oh, I got the Queen.
Oh yes, that's like well done.
Hit the jackpot there.
Yeah, amazing. What was that like? What did she say to you? Or are you allowed to say what the Queen says to you?
I'm allowed to, whether I can remember. Oh yes, that's if you've got your gong for training horses or something, then the Queen's sort of very happy. But if
20-minute conversation then.
If you turn up as a mathematician, you can see the look of sort of terror on her face. What on earth am I going to say? And so I don't know whether I broke protocol, but I thought she did look as though she was worrying about what she could possibly say. So I thought I might help her out a little bit. So I said, I don't know exactly how I put it, but roughly it boiled down to, we last met when you came to Cambridge to open the new maths faculty there. And so she looked sort of relieved and said yes, and something like, is it going well, or something.
So you broke the ice for her.
Yeah, once it's happened, the protocol then dictates that you aren't allowed to turn your back on the Queen, so you have to walk backwards away from her before turning and returning to your seat. So I sort of headed backwards. And
for people who don't understand my excitement, by the way, when you get a knighthood, it could be conferred upon you by the monarch herself, or it could be like, Prince Charles or someone else, the Duke of Cambridge. And so I always think getting the monarch themselves is like top level. So you were lucky. You're the first person I've met with a knighthood who also got the monarch. Everyone else I've met got Prince Charles. So well done. Luck of the draw. Or were you special?
No. I think I was just I think Prince Charles was doing some of them around that time, and I think one would be even luckier now. I think the Queen does fewer and fewer of them as she gets older and older, because she has to stand for a long time to do it. And
do these things mean much to you? Do Fields Medals and knighthoods and things like, how do you feel about them?
The Fields Medal is a complicated one. I mean, I think you can't, unless you're a really 100% shoe-in for the Fields Medal, which I wasn't. But if you're somebody like Peter Scholzer recently, who everybody sort of knew for years that he was going to get a Fields Medal, I think you feel a little bit of a sort of imposter syndrome, because especially as one progresses, you just see more and more younger mathematicians doing completely incredible things that you couldn't have done yourself, and you feel more acutely that you're just one person in a large community of very good people. So in a way, you start thinking, well, the Fields Medal doesn't mean all that much. But that's something it's much easier to say if you've got one. So I don't really mean that. It has meant, in a way, a huge amount that I sort of relax about whether I'm going to be remembered after my death for any length of time. I'll be on that list. And that's been, I think that does change one's.
Is that motivating, or does it make you rest on your laurels?
Yeah, well, that is you may be aware that there was some literature about that, and somebody did a study of the subsequent mathematical output of 1, Fields medalists, and 2, people who were, for various reasons, thought of as strong candidates for Fields medals who didn't get them. There's quite a strong effect that the people who didn't quite get them have produced more papers and things than the people who did.
Were you part of that study? You must have been.
I suppose I was, yes. I've never produced a huge number of papers. I mean, I've always been my total number of papers is not that high for somebody of my age. But one of the things that was suggested was that if people who've got Fields medals feel freer to do slightly different things, it's not that they stop working altogether, although maybe that does happen in some cases, but that they just might have other projects in life, and when they're not any longer struggling for recognition in mathematics, they can afford to do that. So in my case, that has been the case a little bit. So, for example, I took on editing a book called The Princeton Companion to Mathematics, which was an absolutely massive task. It took, I would estimate, half my working time for about 5 years or something like that. So that was a big chunk to take out, but it was a project I believed in, and I probably wouldn't have actually been offered the chance to do it if I hadn't been a Fields medalist, but I also might well have thought I can't do that because my research is too important.
Yeah.
And my research definitely did suffer while I was doing that to some extent. It freed me up. I've got interested in artificial intelligence and automatic theorem proving in mathematics, which are things that I've perhaps taken a bit more seriously and devoted more time to than I would have felt I could if I'd not somehow become fully established as a mathematician.
Can I ask you what research looks like? I'm always fascinated by the idea of mathematicians doing research. I've got a week, I'm just going to spend a week doing research. What does that look like? Do you sit at this table here with a piece of paper and a pencil? Do you go for a walk or ride a bike? Or do you how do you, if you've got time set aside to have an idea, how do you have an idea?
It's changed a bit over the years. So when I started out, it was just paper and pen, and then I would try and have ideas, and when I did have an idea, I'd write them up using pen and paper, and only when I was done would I then type it up, because typing was so much less convenient. Now I use a screen much more, and I also now, almost all my research these days is in collaboration, mainly with my research students. So one thing that I like to do with research students is have a private blog where we all write posts with our ideas and comments on posts. Little just nuggets of thought. So actually that works quite well, because sometimes it's quite nice to have a little time limit. So supposing I've got 20 minutes before lunch, and I think I just want to make an iota of progress between now and lunchtime. I can sort of look at the blog, what was my thought just then. It doesn't have to be answering a question that we've been struggling with for months. It can be just one idea. I think maybe the mysterious thing is when you read a solution to a problem, it's just all there as one unit, and everything seems to depend on everything else. And so you might ask, how can all that come into your head at once? And the answer is it can't come into your head at once. You have to break it down. And this breaking down process is quite an interesting one. But the fundamental activity is, I would say, the following. You've got a question. You don't know what the answer is. You think there's pretty well no hope of just seeing the answer to that question. So you ask another question. And the other question will be something that you judge to be easier to answer and something that will shed light on the first question. So once you've answered it, your task of answering the original question will have become just a little bit easier. And if you can do that enough, and then this is an iterative process, so your first question may be very hard. You may reduce it to an easier question, or not necessarily reduce it, but you may come up with an easier question that feels useful in that way, which again you can't answer. And if you can't, then you try and find an even easier one. And there are various different ways of generating easier questions. So you might, for example, generalize the first question and see whether you really needed all the hypotheses. And then the answer may be, actually the question becomes cleaner and easier to answer once you've generalized it. Or it might be that once you've generalized it, you find a counterexample which tells you that the hypothesis that you got rid of was in fact necessary and would form an integral part of any positive solution to the first question. Once you know that, it's sort of, you're a bit better on the scent of how to answer the question, because you know that somewhere along the line you've got to use such and such. So when you're trying to solve a problem, you're sort of searching for the particular chain of reasoning that will lead to the solution. And what you're trying to do when finding it is not necessarily to find it straight off, but just to narrow down the search for this chain of reasoning. You say, well, I don't know how to prove it, but I know that any argument that I'm going to come up with that works is going to have these properties. And the more you can get those properties to narrow down the chain of what the chain of reasoning can look like, the easier it becomes to find the chain of reasoning.
Does that mean, in your case at least, like the best proofs and great discoveries that you've been responsible for haven't had a moment where you suddenly something switched and you were like, oh my goodness, why didn't I think of that before? Is it just like a series of tiny versions of that and it all gets muddled? Or do they still sometimes have this moment where you're walking across a bridge or standing in the shower and it's like, oh, something changes in your brain. It's like, oh, that's it. That's the thing.
I have had a few moments like that. It's a sort of mixture, but quite often it's been a case of needing... so there are one or two examples where I think I could pinpoint the moment where I went from feeling as though I really was quite a long way from having a solution to some sort of thing, maybe confident after that moment that once I'd dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, I'd have a solution. Much more common is to need 5 or 6 moments like that, but smaller moments. So you've done a lot of sort of reducing to easier questions, which are quite hard. And then you have a little sort of mini aha moment and solve one of those questions and then another one.
Move back up to the higher question.
Yeah, something like that. One of the best compliments I ever had was giving a talk on the result I mentioned earlier, Semiradius Theorem. And a wonderful Hungarian mathematician called Imre Ruja came up after the talk and said, that proof had 3 ideas. Somehow it was a sort of a 3-idea proof, not just a 1 idea that unlocked the argument.
Nice. Just finally, because I know I don't want to keep you all day. I do want to keep you all day, but I know I'm not allowed to. You talked about working on like AI and machine learning and to do proofs. This is an area I find really interesting. Are computers going to put mathematicians out of business? Is that realistic? Like, do you think it could get to the point where the computers are doing it?
I think it will. I don't know how long it'll take. I think, although I could be wrong, that the current burst of activity in machine learning, while it's amazing for certain applications, is not going to be the thing that puts mathematicians out of business without a certain amount of input, which would not be easy input.
Right.
Into really understanding the processes that go on when mathematicians do research. A sort of blind thing where you just train a network by showing it lots of proofs until it sort of suddenly starts spewing out proofs for itself. I don't think that's very likely to be the answer. So that's not at all the way I've been... That's the type of thing I've been thinking. I've been really thinking about something that's always interested me as a mathematician anyway, which is what is it that's... I mean, you've already asked about it. What is it that's going on when we do research? How do we find these needles in haystacks? And I think that that's a fascinating problem in itself. And even if it doesn't lead to a computer program that puts us out of business, it's well worth thinking about.
But you think it will? So you're thinking it will just be a different kind of computer program. It will be like a paradigm change. It won't be just more and more power to the sort of the pattern recognition. And
no, I think pattern recognition may well come in, because there's no doubt that mathematicians do use pattern recognition. I think it'll be some kind of hybrid of rule-based logical thought with quite a lot of non-determinism in it, because obviously we don't just apply some simple algorithm, but that with the sort of advances that there have been in machine learning. If you talk to a mathematician about how they found something out, it'll be a mixture of a very coherent narrative about, I was thinking about this and then I realized that such and such, and then that thing that I've been trying couldn't work, but then if you tweaked it like this, those sorts of things. But there are other things where you ask a mathematician, well, what made you think that that result was likely to be true? And they said, well, I don't know, my just experience kind of tells me that a statement like that had a good chance of being true. I'm not quite sure why.
Intuition.
There's a certain intuition. Now, I feel that the intuitive parts where it's rather hard to explain how you felt the way you felt as a mathematician, those parts might well be amenable to machine learning, because somehow that seems to be what machine learning is good at. It's doing things that you do sort of instinctively and can't really explain. So I can't sort of explain to you how I know that a line drawing of a cat is of a cat. I can, to some extent, maybe a little bit. I say it's got a little pointy ear there, but I couldn't sort of give you a systematic procedure for distinguishing between cat pictures and dog pictures.
It's funny to me that you say that that's the thing the machines could do, because I think most people who are defensive about machine learning, that's the thing they say the computers could never do. That's the one thing we've got, is that kind of instinct that a computer could never replace that aspect of my humanity. But you seem to think that's the thing the computers will do really well.
Well, I think they'll do the whole lot, but I think that part, the sort of instinctive judgments that we make, which aren't completely illogical, but I mean they've got a whole. They can be justified to some extent, but at some point when you try to justify things, you start running into difficulty. You say, well, I've seen things a bit like that, and I've seen things a bit like that, and this feels like one of those. That is a sort of pattern recognition that's going on. So I think machine learning would have a role to play in those. So a big part of what you do when you do mathematics is what you might call probability judgments. If, for example, you are trying to solve a problem and there's an intermediate statement that would imply an answer to the problem that you want to answer, it's not enough to say, okay, well, that would imply it, so I'm now going to work flat out on the intermediate statement. There's another thing you need, which is some kind of judgment of whether the intermediate statement is likely to be true, whether it's likely to be easier than the problem you started with, that sort of thing. Because otherwise you're risking spending a lot of time and not getting anything for it.
Will I get a return on investment?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that is a huge part of efficient research, is judging the return that you'll get on some kind of intellectual investment or time investment, basically. And
do you think that separates some of the better mathematicians from the inferior ones or less successful ones?
I think it does, yes. I mean, I think that sort of strategic. I do think it really helps when you're doing research to step outside yourself and say, am I making the best use of my time by doing this? And it's very tempting not to. It's very tempting just to, and I've succumbed to this temptation the whole time, just sort of get interested in something you're not quite sure why. It's maybe not the most important thing in the world, but it becomes the most important thing in the world for you for a while. Or another temptation that it's very easy to succumb to is just deciding what you think the answer to a problem is and just more or less ignoring the possibility that it might go the other way, because you just become emotionally attached and you want that problem to have a positive answer and not a counterexample. That was one example in my own career where I really was keen. I thought it would be such a beautiful theorem, and I never proved it, and eventually some other people found a counterexample.
So you kind of dodged a bullet there.
I sort of did, yes. If they hadn't found that counterexample, maybe I would have wasted a whole lot more time on it. But it wasn't a total waste, actually. It rarely is. But I do think time management is an important part. And I've just talked about examples where I've, on the face of it, not managed my time. But actually, I think also there's a sort of meta way of looking at things where not managing your time in a way that seems optimal can actually be good. So just getting a little bit obsessed or emotionally attached to a problem can give you the motivation that you need in order to make progress with that problem. Whereas if you'd taken a more calculating approach as to what was worth doing, you might have thought, perhaps I better not.
I mean, even in my career, I've always thought sometimes being successful means doing what the other person's not willing to do. And that sometimes means those things that appear like they won't be good return on investment.
Yes, and that's particularly, that is another consideration, I think, when you're doing research. One of the things one of the very important judgments you have to make all the time is not just, is this likely to be true? Is it likely to be easy to prove? But is this likely to be the way of solving the problem, given that several clever people have thought about the problem and not solved it? If it's a fairly standard thing, if there's no quirkiness to the idea, you have to have some plausible story as to why nobody solved a problem. Sometimes it's a problem you came up with yourself and it hasn't been something that other people have thought about. But if it's something that other people have thought about, it actually helps this thing of narrowing down the search for what a proof could look like. It can be very helpful to say, it cannot be this because this is something that other people would have thought of if correct. This is a thing that mathematical cranks don't understand. They come up with some very simple proof of Fermat's last theorem and they don't realize that if it had looked like that, even slightly, and been correct, then it would have been discovered in the 17th century rather than having to wait till the 21st century. But it applies also at a research level, and I think sometimes an inexperienced research student may get excited about an approach that a more experienced mathematician will say that, okay, it's good to think about that and understand why it doesn't work, but it's not going to work because if it did work, then it would have been done already.
You don't find many huge gold nuggets just still sitting on the ground when you go to a
very occasionally happens, and it's again one of those things that if it does, it's slightly damaging in some ways because it encourages people to think that that's typical when it's not at all typical.
What are you doing at the moment? What's taking up your time at the moment besides having me in your office and some posh dinner you've got to go to tonight? Are you in a research mode at the moment or book mode? Or
Definitely research, although at the moment I'm feeling a sort of pressure that it comes in waves, but a pressure of things that are basically done but not yet properly written up.
That sounds like a good problem to have. It sounds like the hard part's done.
It is, but when you've got enough of them, it can induce a sort of paralysis, and one always wants, rather than, particularly if they've been hanging around for a while, so it takes a while to get back into it enough to be able to work out how to change an old write-up, that sort of thing.
So these are proofs or solutions or things that you and your collaborators have nailed down, and you've just got to write it up now in the correct format and get it published, is that?
Yes, but sometimes when you've nailed it, it can look really quite horrible and complicated, and
That's a really frustrating thought for me, that sitting on all these desks and in all these drawers around math departments around the world is like stuff that's going to push the field forward and no one knows about just because it's hard to write.
A few months ago I sat down and just wrote a list of all the things that I've proved that I've not yet put out there.
Tell me the Riemann hypothesis.
No. It's not that sort of thing. But sort of, if I were to write up everything I know, everything I've done, what would there be? And it was slightly depressing because there are things there that I quite like, but I just kind of know in my heart of hearts they're not ever going to get done because there are other more important things that still need writing up, particularly ones with research students where it matters a lot to them, obviously. When one's writing up, it's usually a fairly thought-provoking process, and it's always much more fun to be thinking about solving problems than just writing up things that one did some time ago. Anyway, so I'm in a phase like that. I need to do something about it and clear my backlog a bit. And
well, Professor, if that's not my cue to end this interview and leave, I don't know what is. So thank you.
Not at all.
Did you ever grow a beard?
No, basically. Actually, this summer, just for fun, I decided not to shave for a week or so.
How'd it go?
A week wasn't enough for it to become more than sort of designer stubble, really.
Right.
It was interesting, but it's not...
not your look?
I don't think so.
Well, that's all for today. We'll include some links relevant to the show in the usual places. Also, as usual, our thanks to the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute for supporting the podcast, and thanks to the audio engineering company Maya Sound in Berkeley, California, for supporting this episode. I'm Brady Harron. You've been listening to the Numberphile podcast, and we'll see you again soon for another episode.